Thank you. I'm going to set out the task we were given and explain briefly how we approached it, and I'll then hand over to Marilyn, who's going to take us through the 5 issues that kept coming up and that we've chosen to focus on today and in our report. So as Bob said, our research has addressed one central question: what needs to happen for communities to feel and be powerful in the 2020s? And our focus was on communities of place facing disadvantage. So we approached our research question through a series of 3 dialogues carried out over 18 months, which together have enabled us to capture the ideas, experiences and opinions of more than 800 people from across the UK. The first dialogue enabled us to scope the issues and ideas that we would need to explore. The second involved testing and developing our findings in the nations and regions of the UK. And in our third and final dialogue, we heard from people in 4 places about how they would address our research question. And in each dialogue, we used a mixture of interviews, meetings, conversations and workshop formats, as well as maintaining an open call survey for contributions. The themes that emerged as the dialogues progressed were tested at successive stages, as well as being shared and debated in workshops and at conferences. And we published working papers as we went along, and those are still available online if people want to read them. So by visiting different nations, regions and localities, what we wanted to do was to stand in a different place and find out what we would get back when we asked our question there. So in the report that you'll be able to find online after this conference, we don't suggest for a moment that we've arrived at a comprehensive assessment of community development or community life in any one region, locality or nation. But we use those opportunities to hear from people across the UK and to find out what appeared to be the dominant issues overall. There were probably 3 critical terms: community, power, community development, that we used a great deal in the research, but that we only loosely defined. We chose not to define community, and instead we invited people to talk about what community means to them on their own terms. And we'd encourage you to do the same in our discussions today that Bob is going to organise after our presentation. Now, before I hand over to Marilyn to take us through the findings, I want to just say one more thing about the way we analysed the data that we collected. The film is quite a stark reminder of how difficult things are, but our cutting room floor from this research is knee-deep in really fantastic, wonderful things happening in communities all of the time. It's also knee-deep in a lot of struggles that aren't for us to address here or in this research. What we've done, with the help of many of you in the room today, is to pick out what appear to be the 5 issues that really mattered if we want communities to feel and be powerful in the future. And you won't find a list of recommendations in the report, but what you will find is woven into the 5 issues we're about to share are concrete, specific things that can be done about the issues that we're raising. And in the discussion that follows this presentation, we invite you to add your ideas, your experience to what you see as the important issues for debate, and suggest who you think might be able to take forward some of the actions that we imply. I'll now hand over to Marilyn.
Hello, it's great to see you all here and to see the level of interest that this is awakening, and welcome also to all those who are watching on the streaming. So, and I'm looking forward to hearing how you think we can take it all forward. So, as Leila says, we were asked to focus on communities of place, and we set out with 2 starting assumptions, which we tested constantly through the research. The first was that place is important, despite rapid changes in the economy, in technology, and in the way we relate to each other. Place is still important to people, especially to many of those in areas that have been left behind by the pace of change. Secondly, power is collective. To realise their power, people benefit from working together, to identify common issues, to find ways of addressing them together, and to be seen, heard, and taken seriously by the power holders whose decisions affect their lives. But as we progress, we added a third, and that is that identity matters. For some people, identity, ethnic, but also other significant attachments people have, is as important, sometimes more important than place, and place-based approaches need to recognise this. As the research progressed, 5 themes kept coming up in our conversations, and some of these were reflected in the film. These were poverty, transience, fragmentation, isolation, and democracy. For each, I'm going to describe what is happening in communities, what's being done locally to address each issue, and what is needed beyond the community if sustainable change is to be achieved. So, we take first the winner in the film. We take poverty first because it's a defining feature of many of the communities we were looking at. The impact of austerity and welfare reform on poorer areas across the UK is well documented, as well as the impact of increasing reliance on insecure and low-paid gig economy jobs. High streets deserted by the market, public services withdrawn, and transport links to jobs and more centralised services poor or non-existent. These are communities who've relied more than most on public services, and yet they're expected to fill the gaps left by the withdrawal of these services. How are people who are struggling to survive and or trying to manage 2 or 3 insecure jobs, how are they expected to engage with their community at all, let alone take over responsibility for vital services? Against the odds, communities are finding ways to support each other. In our report, we mentioned some of their initiatives: community food and energy projects, credit unions, community businesses, training and enterprise creation, and campaigns. But we stress the fact that there's a limit to what can be done locally. As one of our contributors put it, what people can do locally is absolutely at the margins. We know that poverty is not created locally and cannot be resolved locally, but it can be drawn attention to. So, sustainable change has to come from beyond the neighbourhood. This might mean drawing on ideas from councils like Preston, who are commissioning locally, from a business in Rotherham that's working with young people and aiming to keep the Rotherham pound in Rotherham. It might mean persuading businesses more generally to play a bigger role alongside communities, local authorities, and other key institutions in developing more ambitious strategies for change. Our next 2 issues are concerned with population change and its impact. The first is transience. We argue that a powerful community is one where people choose to live, where they feel connected, where they feel safe. But this is often not the case. When I started out in community development, a lot of our work was on council estates, single tenure with comparatively stable populations. I lived on one in the 1970s and 1980s. But this has changed. Right to buy has become right to buy to let, too often in poor conditions, on higher rents and with no security of tenure. We heard of benefit reforms moving families far away from their support structures, and also of tenants who were opposing redevelopment schemes because they feared that they would have limited opportunities to return to the few affordable homes that remained. One of our contributors said on his estate that social networks are being eroded because of enforced moves. In rural areas, families and low-paid workers find themselves priced out of the market by second homes and incomers from more affluent areas. What does community mean to people who might have to move on in 6 months or less? And what does this transience and insecurity mean for their neighbours? We heard about a range of local responses to housing insecurity and unavailability, including the growing number of community land trusts. In parts of Scotland, community-led housing associations still thrive. Where I come from, in Bristol, individual advocacy and campaigns to improve housing conditions for private tenants are meeting with success. But it's difficulty to see this housing insecurity changing in the foreseeable future without a significant change in national policy. We argue that a powerful community is one where people feel they belong and where everyone can contribute. But the second outcome of population change that came up in our conversations relates to fragmentation. Our society is becoming more diverse. Population change can bring new vitality into an area, but it can also be challenging, especially when existing residents feel neglected and insecure, or when it means that already stretched services are stretched even further. A strong sense of community can exclude as well as include. As I said at the outset, if communities are to be more powerful together, we need to work with and across communities of identity as well as place. Traditional forms of organising and community representation may not be relevant to people from newer or widely dispersed communities of identity, or indeed to the transient private tenants we were talking about before, and may even exclude them. So how do we maximise the benefits of our diverse society, but challenge the divisions and othering that we see around us and seek common cause? We found many examples where this was happening locally. Simple things like gardening and food, community arts, we saw something on there about film, storytelling, intergenerational work. As one person said, gardening can bring a touch of home to diverse migrant communities. Everybody eats. Food connects. None of this is rocket science, but it all makes small changes on which larger transformations can be built. And those larger transformations also need action from beyond the community. Targeted investment to support communities that are facing major population change, for example. And dare I say it, responsible and positive media coverage. Both transience and fragmentation can be addressed by increasing the opportunities for people to connect. But our fourth issue, isolation, was about the loss of the spaces where they can do this, and that's something else that came up in the film. The spaces where people gather and bump into each other, where they can meet, learn and organise together. Public pubs, libraries, post office branches, children's and youth centres, parks, bingo halls. A recent publication from Local Trust calls these spaces social infrastructure and argues that it is as important to the health of our society as economic infrastructure. This social infrastructure has been eaten away by cuts, by the way the market works, by deindustrialisation. Our Welsh contributors still refer to the legacy of the closure of the mines in South Wales and the loss of the intricate social infrastructure that they provided. The availability of these spaces has also been affected by the fact that services have gone online. As one person said, I think the closure of the post office and also the way banking is now really affects older people. They like to talk to people. Venues that used to be free now have to charge, and even £10 can be a lot for a small group. Security measures, however necessary, create barriers to schools, to libraries, even to neighbours popping in on one another. This means there's nowhere for community groups to meet or hold events. The widespread closure of youth services leaves young people with nowhere to go. So they congregate on street corners and people start seeing them as a threat. And social media, online entertainment, smartphones have all changed the way that we live and the way we connect. Several people commented that people just stay at home more. So, what can be done? This is the meat and drink of community development and similar approaches. Listening to people, taking them seriously, connecting people up. We argue for the importance of community hubs and that the transfer of community buildings and other assets to communities can only work if there is an investment in their maintenance and in the people who run them as well. And we give examples of community arts and heritage initiatives which can draw everyone in. We also look at the potential of digital spaces. Our contributors argued that those working with the disadvantaged communities really need to get up to speed with new technologies. so that they can exploit them to the full. But they also warn of the dangers of relying too much on this new route, and I'll come back to this. And beyond the community, the local trust publication that I referred to earlier, Skittled Out, argues for investment in this social infrastructure, stressing again that it is as important as economic infrastructure to our society. Our contributors also spoke of the role business has in supporting the local community from which it draws its workers and its customers. Our final issue was democracy. What has been abundantly clear from our dialogues is the alienation that many people feel from formal politics and the democratic system. On the states just accept their lot. They're not empowered to have a voice, and even if they were, they're fed up with being consulted and nothing ever changes. I spoke earlier about the disappearance of the mining industry in South Wales, and with it, the institutions where people found their collective working class voice. What are their equivalents today? Our contributors spoke instead about a politics of blame, of divide and rule by politicians and the media, and the rise of populist politics. They spoke about the depoliticisation of public life. Politics is a dirty word, something that happens far away in Westminster, and about the silencing of critical voices in communities and the third sector more generally. So what is needed locally? We return to the spaces theme here. The need to create spaces for grown-up conversations that allow for the expression of different opinions and where difficult conversations can take place and move forward. Our contributors argued for effective political and civic education in schools and beyond, and for the importance of community organising as a power-based approach. Social media emerged again as having enormous potential, but also needing to be handled with care. Our contributors raised issues around digital exclusion, trolling, never sure how to pronounce that, and being trapped in bubbles. So they argued that its greatest power is realised when combined with opportunities that are face-to-face. Beyond the community, contributors made a case for more experiments with deliberative forms of democracy. Maybe the extension of parish and town councils with their power to raise a precept, although these also have their challenges and their critics. They also argued the importance of working upriver, providing opportunities for communities to come together to address the issues that cannot be resolved locally, and the need for national bodies to support and magnify their voices and give them access to centres of power. And they spoke of the need to revitalise the way political institutions operate across the board, providing space and encouragement for learning and development at all levels. So finally, what does this mean for those working in and with communities in the future? We were told in no uncertain terms that telling poor communities to be resilient is patronising. Poor communities know how to be resilient, but they can't go it alone. Our contributors highlighted the impact that cuts have had on the community sector and its infrastructure at local and national level, and including training. They highlighted the way contract funding threatens the independence of community-based organisations and sets them up in competition with each other. They were irritated at programmes that operate in separate silos at local level, and at the way branding of particular approaches can divide rather than unite people across the sector, although some feel that that's now changing. There was a lot of concern about the issue of co-option. Against a background of austerity, community development and similar approaches inevitably face the challenge that they're complicit in an agenda that expects the poorest and most desperate communities to fill the gaps left by austerity and spending cuts. So what did our contributors feel was needed? They argued for investment in the social, community and political infrastructure and resources proportionate to the needs of different communities. We have learnt that small grants and light support can make all the difference to some communities, but the more intensive community development support and investment is needed to address the stresses we have described in the poorest areas. And they argued for the will, but also the skills on the part of service providers, local institutions and decision makers to work alongside communities in addressing the need for change. These might include housing associations, health authorities, schools, further and higher education, as well as local authorities and businesses. To conclude then, throughout our report we underline the fact that communities and those who work with them are responding with commitment and energy to the challenges they face. They now need policies and the investment that recognises the disadvantages that they bear and that confront lazy and discriminatory assumptions about many of the people who live there. Society, government, business and wider civil society needs to get behind them